Hi, I'm Alais.
And I'm Michael. Today we'll be showing you how to make cheese, specifically in this case Gouda, which is a wash curd brine cheese.
We'll be showing you the process we use and taking you through the supplies and materials. And hopefully you will enjoy this as much as we do. The cheeses we make are hard cheeses. Hard cheeses are firm or hard in texture due to the removal of a high percentage of moisture during the cheese making process, and they're also pressed and aged for full flavor development. All of them go through the same series of steps with variations depending on the recipe. Usually those were developed regionally. So first off, ripening. Ripening is when a bacterial starter is added to convert milk sugar to lactic acid. You warm the milk to encourage the bacterial starter, and that development of acid encourages your whole process, encourages separation into curds and whey, and coagulation and preservation and flavor development. The next step is renneting. You add rennet, which is a coagulant, and that coagulates milk protein into a solid mass of curd in which your whey is trapped. After ripening and renneting, your next step is cutting. You cut the curd, and this releases the trapped whey. You want to cut it, and you cut it into ideally uniform portions. While ripening, renneting, and cutting are pretty much universal, the way you cook your curds tends to be what makes a difference. The first step that makes a difference to how your cheese is going to taste and what its texture is going to be. Then after when doing that, removes more whey and moisture, and it also firms up the curd. The next steps are salting, molding, and pressing. So if you were making a cheddar, you would break the curd up into smaller pieces and distribute salt through it evenly and then put it in the mold. If you're making a Gouda like we are today, you go right ahead and mold and press the cheese first, and then you brine it to add salt.
Once your curds are prepared, the next step is molding and pressing your cheese. Your curds are placed in a mold and are pressed under increasing pressure over a period of up to 24 hours. This removes the remaining whey and consolidates the curds into a single cheese.
And there are a whole bunch of different ways that you can finish a cheese after you've pressed it. It can be air dried, or it can be bandaged, or it can be smoked or waxed, or rubbed with oil, or recently there's been a trend for cheeses rubbed in beer. So there's all kinds of variations that can change flavor development at that stage as well. And usually it needs to be kept at a specific temperature for a specific period of time. So that's how you make hard cheeses in general. Specifically today we're going to be making Gouda. And Gouda is a washed curd, brined hard cheese. And washed curd means that when we reach the cooking stage, we take out whey and replace it with water. And that washes lactose away from the curd and lowers the acidity, and that's how you end up with a cheese with a mild flavor that ripens very quickly. So where another cheese might need 6 to 8 months to cure, Gouda only needs 12 weeks. You can cure it for longer if you want to, but you can eat it at 12 weeks. It's also brined, which means that at the stage where you press it, and then you put it in a salt water solution for 12 hours to brine it. You do this because with a cheese that ages very quickly, you want your salt to come in from the outside to help develop rind instead of being on the inside where it would slow your aging time and affect the flavor. This is an SCA class. We should talk about history. The earliest known mention of Gouda is from 1184, which makes it the earliest known documentation of a cheese that is still currently eaten today. And it was from the market in Gouda, because in the Netherlands at the time, a market could request a monopoly on a particular type of good. So Gouda had a monopoly on selling cheeses. Gouda basically just means a cheese made in the traditional Dutch way. And Dutch farmers' wives would make cheeses in their dairies and then bring them into Gouda to sell them. It's still made today, but it has to have a very specific name to specifically mean Dutch farmer's cheese made in Holland, and that's Boerenkaas. Anybody who else can make a cheese and in this process can call it Gouda and sell it that way.
I've been asked what the difference is between our modern technique of making cheese and the way cheese was made in period. They did understand that it was important to keep a clean, separate area for cheese production, and if they could afford it, have servants whose sole job was dairy production. However, we use freeze-dried bacteria cultures so that we can control the result of our cheese making. They relied on bacteria naturally occurring in their environment and their materials. And we use commercially produced rennet. The process I have found in research for acquiring rennet in period involved taking the fourth stomach of a very young calf and preparing it and hanging it for 2 years. So not terribly hygienic. So other than that, though, the chemistry is still the same. The steps that you take are still the same. It's just that what we do has more regard for health and safety and is a little more accurate. Here are some commercial sources for cheesemaking supplies. Glengarry Cheesemaking is where we buy most of our supplies. They started as a supplier to small cheese factories and then expanded to also sell to hobbyists. So there's a lot of really great stuff on their site. They sell a really good beginner kit with a press, but their site doesn't have a lot of explanation of what the various things you're looking at are for. New England Cheesemaking is in the States, but their website is a really useful resource. It has a lot of recipes, a lot of interviews with cheesemakers, and they also sell supplies and hold workshops. Make Cheese sells cheesemaking kits. You've probably seen them at Chapters or other places like that, where it's a cardboard box and it's got everything you need in it to make mozzarella this weekend, kind of thing. So if you're interested in cheese making, but you were feeling a little tentative about it, it's a way to start. Where to get more information about cheese making? Professor David Funkhauser at the University of Cincinnati has a really great website. He's been using cheese making for years in his microbiology classes, and he has a lot of recipes, a lot of photo spreads, and also some tips on making your own presses. Curd Nerd is relatively new, but it's a forum for cheesemakers, not attached to any kind of commercial production. And if you're looking for historical information, Waldetrudis von Metten is a member of the SCA who has a blog that records the cheeses she made for her SCA 50 project. I found that very useful. And if you're looking for a period source, Gervase Markham's The English Housewife. The 6th chapter is all about dairies and things, necessary things belonging to that office. And that is where I found out the information about the process of making rennet in period.
And now I guess it's time to get on with making cheese. Supplies. The first thing to remember with supplies is that cleanliness is paramount. You're working with bacteria, and you don't want bacteria from elsewhere to interfere. So if you do sourdough or kombucha making, you want to keep those materials out of the kitchen. And if you can do it, having a dedicated set of supplies for cheese making will really help as well. Most of our supplies are things that we got at the dollar store or a Canadian Tire very inexpensively. Wherever possible, try to go for non-reactive, so glass, enamel, or stainless steel. Our measuring set is plastic at the moment, but we're hoping to upgrade. But where we did spend the money is on a press. This one is from Glengarry, but later I will show you how to make a smaller press with materials you'll find around the home. So we have, as I said, measuring cups and a measuring jug, the press, some small containers for mixing the additives that you'll put in the milk, a long-handled mixing spoon. You need something to cut the cheese with. You can get a cheese knife, but we just use an icing spatula. And utensils like these are useful for scooping curds out. And this is you'll need a thermometer. This is a yogurt thermometer. So this runs specifically to the range that we'll be looking for, but I've had success as well with meat or candy thermometers.
And all of these are washed beforehand and then sterilized before we do anything with them at all.
Yes. This is cheese wax. It comes in yellow or red, and it's specifically made for cheese making. You can also just use beeswax. I've done that before. A lot of cheeses also don't need to be waxed. It's your choice. When you put your cheese in a mold, you need to wrap it. And the directions will say to wrap it in cheesecloth. They do not mean the kind of cheesecloth that you buy at the grocery store. It has far too open a weave, and if you have very fine curds, they will just go straight through it. The first time I made cheese, what I used was an old bale that I cut up. So this is just handkerchief weight linen. Liquid goes through it, solids don't. I then found out about gourmet cheesecloth, cheesemaker's cheesecloth. It has a much tighter weave. You see there. And it can go through the laundry. So this is what it looks like after it's been washed. And all you do is put it in boiling water before you mold your cheese so that it gets sterilized as well, scalded, and you're good to go. There's also a product that they sell at Glengarry. Some of it came with my mold. That is a plastic microporous product. I don't use it very often. I wouldn't worry about that one, but it is available if you're interested. And that's it for supplies.
The milk is going to be your big expense in the cheese making process. You have to put in a fair bit of it. So why this is not a way to save money on buying cheese. This is definitely a hobby to get into because you're curious about it, or you would like to try different flavors of cheese, or you want to experiment, not as a cost-saving measure. The one we are doing today, there will be 8 liters of milk.
Material. Obviously, your first material is milk. You want to use as high fat of milk as you can get. Cow's milk. You could also use sheep or goat's milk, but you'll want to get specific directions for using those kind of milks. The fat balance is different. You want high fat, and you also want not ultra high temperature pasteurized. You will only be able to get pasteurized milk if you're in Ontario and if you're in many other places in North America. Raw milk is very hard to get. As far as that goes, raw milk isn't necessarily the best thing to pick anyway, because it's quite likely to have other bacteria in it that will compete with your cheese bacteria. So a low heat pasteurized milk is probably your best bet. We are using some organic milk that we got from our local Metro. It's unusual in that it's a grocery store that sells this kind of milk. Usually we have to get it from a health food store. But that being said, we live in an urban center and we're able to get milk that's suitable for cheese making. If all you can get is ultra high temperature pasteurized or a fairly low fat milk, something that you can add is calcium chloride. And calcium chloride will help coagulate more curds out of the milk. So that improves your process if you can't get the ideal milk. We will be using a coagulant. We will be using liquid rennet. Just like the calcium chloride, I got this from Glengarry. And Glengarry is a great distributor if you live in Ontario. If you're watching this from further afield, there are suppliers just about everywhere. You just have to do a little bit of searching. In the eastern U.S., New England cheesemaking is a really great place to look for it. Something else that you might look for, but we will not be using today, is annatto, which is a natural colorant that is used in some traditional cheese recipes. We don't need it for the cheese we're doing today. We will be using bacteria, as we've mentioned a few times. We'll be using mesophyll type 2 bacteria. And again, I got that from Glengarry. You can get it from a number of different places. And there are a number of different bacteria you can get. So you want to check your recipe and make sure you get the right kind of bacteria to get the result that you want. And we have our milk all set up in our enamelware pot. So it's a non-reactive container. And now we'll be getting on with the first steps of making the cheese.
So we've got the milk heating up. We want it at 90 degrees. As you can see, the thermometer is in it. It's just easier to keep track of it if you leave the thermometer in it, especially as the stove will stay hot. And keep an eye on it and stir regularly. You want this to be a consistent temperature. Other than that, we will come back next when it's actually at 90 degrees.
So our milk has finally heated to 90 degrees. That took about 20 minutes. You want to do that slowly because you want to maintain this heat once you reach there. We've now turned the heat down fairly low. Now I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoon of the mesophilic starter. Again, this is the bacteria that we're adding. You just drop it right in the pot. And stir it in. After that's mixed in well, we don't see any lumps on the surface. There's bits of fat, but we don't see any lumps of powder. Now we're going to cover it and leave it for 10 minutes and maintaining the temperature so it can ripen. And I'm actually even going to take the thermometer out so that it's completely covered. And we'll put on a timer for 10 minutes. The trick is to maintain the temperature all the way through at 90 degrees. There's another method you can use where you don't use a stove for the heat. You have your pot in a sink and you add hot water to, you surround it with water and add hot water to that to increase the temperature of the milk. Unfortunately, our kitchen really isn't a good size for doing that method. But it's great in the summertime because we don't end up working in a very hot kitchen. And this recipe, Gouda, is really good for summertime cheese making because you're not actually working at a very high temperature for very long. So we're going to let this sit for 10 minutes and then we'll come back and move on to the next step. Our milk has had 10 minutes to sit with the mesophilic starter, or bacteria. And you can already tell it's starting to look a little bit different. Instead of those clumps of fat, we've now got a sort of shimmering fatty surface. And now what we're going to do is first we're going to add some calcium chloride so you can see that happening. We don't technically need it, but it also won't hurt any. So this is some calcium chloride diluted in spring water. You can use spring water or bottled water, or you can take some tap water the night before and leave it sitting out. The point is that you don't want chlorinated water because that will kill off your bacteria, which isn't helpful. So we're just going to add this in and stir it in. And then once that's well stirred in, this is the rennet. So rennet is a coagulant that's made from the lining of a calf's stomach, a young cow's stomach. There are other coagulants that were made in period from nettles, and there's one that was made from thistles, but cow rennet was the primarily used one. There are now artificial ones as well, but this is the most commonly used one then and today. So now I need to stir this for a full minute, and you'll notice that the stirring that I'm using isn't the usual pattern. Instead of going around and around, I'm going up and down. And this is to make sure that the rennet is distributed throughout the entire pot. And then after this has been completely stirred in, we'll check the temperature because we want to maintain this at about 90 degrees. And then we will leave it to sit for 1 hour. So we let the milk sit for a little bit more than an hour. And this is the result. We have curd. That isn't exactly a clean break. If it was a clean break, it would just slice apart at the pressure of my finger, like Moses parting the waters. We suspect it's that our rennet is a little expired and we need to get new rennet. Nonetheless, this is curd and we can work with it. So we're on to the next step. Next thing we need to do is cut the curd. This is the idea is to get relatively even-sized cubes of curd throughout the volume of your pot. If you start out making a grid, that makes sense. The only problem with that is that you're not making cubes. You're making great long tubes. So the trick is that after you've cut your grid, then you take your knife and you start in at a 45-degree angle, following the same grid you used before. And that way, you should be able to cut all of the curd into small pieces. Again, I'm using an offset spatula that's really intended for cake icing. A normal cheese knife curd knife is straight. So and it's a little easier for that operation. So now we are going to leave the curds to sit for 10 minutes. The next stage in the process is to remove 1/3 of the whey from the pot while leaving the rest of the whey and the curd in the pot. Michael is very useful for this process because it requires a lot of strength and a lot of heat. If possible, conserving the whey is a good idea because it can be used to make ricotta, which is a different kind of cheese, later on. We drained off about 1/3 of the whey. It's an estimate, and we strained it while we did it so that there is no curd in the liquid. The curd all went back into the pot, and I'll be conserving this to use for ricotta, as I said. Over here now in the pot, we've got our curd that has been allowed to sit after it was cut, and we have a kettle of boiled water. Our pot is sitting at just below 90. This is where the washed curd part of making Gouda comes in. we're going to replace that water with this until we reach 92 degrees Fahrenheit. You want to be stirring constantly. And keeping an eye on the thermometer as you do it.
The temperature is more important than the volume.
Very true. And that is plenty. Right there. So, keeping an eye on it to make sure it doesn't go far up or down. Now, we are going to leave this. You notice the curd gets a little smaller as you stir it, as it is agitated, and as all those cuts you made start to become obvious. The spoon goes through it too. This is partly also because we have a very soft curd here. Remember, we didn't get that nice clean break, but we'll get something out of this. Okay, so now we're going to let this sit for another 10 minutes. Our 10 minutes are up, and you can see that all of the curds have now sunk beneath the surface of the whey. What's going to happen now is that we're going to pour off more of the whey. This time the goal is to get it to the surface of the curds, so that all that's left is curds covered in whey. And Michael's going to take care of that part. Since the whey at this point has been diluted, I'm not worrying about saving it. So,
do you want to talk about the cheesecloth?
That's where I'm going, darling. Michael is pouring it straight into the sink over a colander lined with cheesecloth. That way, any curd that accidentally falls into the sink gets saved, but the whey just goes down the drain. As I've mentioned before, whey is useful for making ricotta, which is a kind of cheese. Literally, the name means recooked. And basically, you superheat the whey and the remaining fat particulates out of it, and you get a kind of fresh cheese. So I'll be doing that at some point in the future. I put the whey in Ziploc bags and freeze it, and when I have enough, I make ricotta. The cheese thermometer is telling me that our curds are at about 92, which is where we want them. What we're now going to do is pour in enough hot water to just bring the temperature up. This one's a little bit trickier because you have to stir and add water and hold the thermometer because your level of material is so much lower. But you want to bring everything up to 100 degrees at this point. And it doesn't take very much to do it. In fact, I'd say that we just need a tiny bit more. Give that a really good stir. And we are at 100. Now that the temperature of the curds and whey is back up to 100 degrees, we're going to let it sit there for 15 minutes. We're going to stir it frequently. That's to make sure that the curds remain separate and don't get all matted up together. And then after that, we'll take care of the next stage, which is the molding and pressing. So the curds have had 15 minutes at a higher temperature with frequent stirring, and they've actually started to change. If you take a look at them, they've got a sort of heavier graininess to them in the texture, and they become drier. So at this point, one can actually, if I can get this, you can slice them almost in half with a spoon. They're much firmer than they were before when they were all soft and squishy.
Much more like what comes with poutine.
Yes, very much so. Much like what we think of a regular curd as being like. So, this is a good sign. So now at this point, we are going to turn off all the heat, and we are going to let it sit for half an hour. I promised I would show you a way to make a mold at home. I got this method from Walter von Metten, who made 50 cheeses for the SCA 50 competition a few years ago. For this, what you need is a yogurt or sour cream tub, cleaned and sterilized, and its lid, and something to use as a weight. I use a mason jar filled with water, and something like cheesecloth or linen to wrap your cheese around that you want to mold. And what you do is you take your tub, you take your lid, you cut the lid out about the same size as the bottom of the tub, because these lids are invariably not actually cylindrical, they're narrow at the base. When you're molding your cheese, you put your cheesecloth in, you put your curds in, you fold up your cheesecloth.
This is an old cheese that we have already made.
As Jason says. You put in your flat piece, you put on your weight, and ta-da! You are molding a cheese. And you can get an elastic band and wrap it around there, and that will add more pressure as well, so you can increase the pressure on the mold. And this is a really great way to make little cheeses to hand out as presents. So we have waited a half hour, and it is time to press our curds into our mold. So the first thing we're going to do is get rid of the remaining whey. Once again, Michael is going to do his strongman act. And then once they're ready, we'll put them into our mold. And I'll show you that while he's working. This is a mold we got from Glengarry. You can use it to make a 2-pound cheese or a larger cheese, a 4 or 6-pound cheese. This is the setup for the 2-pound cheese. We've put a piece of scalded cheesecloth in it, and then we'll just put the curds in on top. It works by screwing in a top plate and twisting that plate down. Some molds work by by specific weight, and most recipes will tell you press at a certain strength for 20 minutes, and another strength for so many minutes. This one you just go to fingertip tightness. We now have our strained curds, and with very clean hands, I'm just going to scoop them out and plop them into our mold. You can use a ladle or a spoon for this, but sometimes it's just easier to just get your hands in there. I think we might be able to use the larger mold. Yeah, there's enough here that we might want to switch to the larger mold. What do you think, Michael? So, after a brief interlude while we went and found the larger mold, we're now actually going to do a much bigger cheese, which is exciting. We don't usually do the really big cheese. So, but we actually got a lot of curd. Now, you'll notice I've got the mold sitting in a lasagna pan. That's because the whey that's going to come out of the cheese has to go somewhere. You can get special drip trays that look kind of like a baking sheet, but with a one side has a lip that you can put over your sink, which is great if you can leave it like that for 24 hours. I'm much happier with this setup, and we just pour out the whey intermittently. This cloth is now a little small. We'll cut and scald some bigger ones for the next stage of the pressing. And we almost got it all. At this point, what we're going to do is drain it again. So I'm using the cloth and my knuckles just to try and make sure that the curds are evenly distributed and relatively flat on top, but the mold will do most of the work for me. Oh, I need the larger top plate as well. I shall have to go get that. All right, right back. That. And good way down. Quite yet. Okay, and then this is the part that actually does the pressing. So I am squeezing down just to try and create even pressure and a good shape. But this is just the first pressing, so I'm not trying to do something really hard. And we are now going to leave this on its own for 20 minutes.
And what we were saying about the lasagna pan, you can see the amount of liquid that we've already squeezed out of it. And this works exceptionally well at keeping it contained.
Our cheese has been pressing for 20 minutes. And if you look down here, you can see already you're not seeing any liquid sitting inside the mold. It's all in the lasagna tray. So now we're going to undo this. And if you look down inside it again, you can see how different it looks on top. So here's the fun part where we get to take it out, wrap it in a new cloth, and put it back in again the other way, upside down, basically. It's still pretty soft and pretty heavy and pretty wet, but what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to accomplish is, having put a lot of pressure on this side, we now want to put a lot of pressure on the other side. Otherwise, you end up with lopsided cheeses. And this is another cloth that I scalded. It's already holding a shape. But if I tried to pick that up, it would fall apart. And it still needs the support of the cheesecloth. And that's the old cloth. Isn't that pretty? And we'll wrap this up. Oh, and we're out of the kitchen. And there it goes back in. So now we're going to put it again for another 20 minutes. This time we're going to apply a little bit more pressure. Again, until I can see liquid coming out of the cheese. And there we go. I will leave that alone for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back. We'll flip it and wrap it in a new cloth again. And then we're going to leave it for 12 to 16 hours. And we'll see you tomorrow to show you how to brine it. Greetings and welcome back. It's the next day, and it's time to unmold the cheese and put it in the brine. The first thing we're going to do is mix the brine solution. So I have 2 pounds of salt and a gallon of hot, not boiling water, and the calcium chloride. So first off, the salt. Ideally, you'd use cheese salt, which is a flaked salt, non-iodized. We're under lockdown. I don't have access to cheese salt right now. So what I'm using instead is pickling salt. And that's fine too. Pickling salt or kosher salt, or really any kind of salt that doesn't have iodine in it would be okay. And we're going to add that to our water and stir that in. And we're also going to add, it's going to take a little while for the salt to melt into the water. And we're also going to add a tablespoon of the calcium chloride. You do that so that the brine doesn't leach too much calcium out of the cheese, which will change the flavor of it. You can, if you want, save brine. I don't usually bother because that's a storage issue. But after you've used a brine on a cheese, you can boil it and then store it in your fridge and use it again the next time you do make cheese. You only have to put the calcium chloride in for the first cheese. Any future cheeses, you don't need to put calcium chloride in. You can just use the brine as it is. Just make sure you boil it after each cheese. Okay, so feeling that that is sufficiently mixed in, this now needs to be left to chill. And once it has chilled enough, we will be able to put the cheese in it. But it needs to be chilled down to room temperature at least. So we're now at the moment of truth. The brine has been allowed to chill, and you can now see the color is clear. If I scrape the spoon across the bottom, I can feel that the salt has started to precipitate back out again. So that means that the brine is ready. So now we are going to see what the cheese looks like. It's been in the press for 14 hours about. The recommendation is 12 to 16. Good sign. So at this point, the cheese should be able to hold its shape without the mold or the cheesecloth. And it looks like that's the case. Yep. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a cheese. There we are. Next step is just to pat it dry, although this is actually quite dry already. It's not particularly wet. There we are. And now we want to put it in the brine. And there we go. And it's just going to stay in there for 12 hours. And what I'll do is I'll come by every couple hours and flip it over just so because you can see it floats, just to make sure that all the sides of it are in the brine. Well, it's been 12 hours, so it's time to take the cheese out of the brine. I've been flipping it repeatedly throughout the day. So you can see it's still floating. But when I take it out and feel it, it's got a very different texture now. It's actually quite hard, and it's got almost a leathery feel to it, which is very hard to see in the camera, really, but you'll have to take my word for it. The brine is totally clear, and like I said, we could boil it and keep it, but we're not going to, just because we don't want to have to store it. So I'm just going to pat it dry with a clean piece of cheesecloth. This is just an inexpensive chopping board that is reserved for the purpose and that has been cleaned with vinegar. White vinegar is your friend at this stage. If you notice any sort of bloom of mold that you don't like on your cheese, you can wipe it off with white vinegar on a paper towel, just throw it in a paper towel, or on a cloth and clean it. And you want to use white vinegar to wipe down your boards regularly to try and keep that from growing mold as well. So we will meet you at the cheese fridge. Now that the cheese is brined, the only thing left to do is age it. So you want to keep it in a constant temperature for the required time period. For Gouda, you need 12 weeks. If you're just starting out, putting it in the back of your fridge is just fine, but you'll want to really monitor it closely because it's being exposed to a lot of other foods and things that could cause contamination. If you get into this as a hobby, something that I'd suggest is getting an inexpensive wine fridge. You can get them secondhand quite often. This one has a digital temperature setting, which allows us to maintain the temperature that's needed for whatever cheese we are aging. And I just bought some inexpensive cutting boards and cut them down to size to fit on top of the wine racks. Gouda needs to age at 50. It's showing 58 right now because we've been opening the door a lot, but you can see I've actually set it to 50. And yeah, you just go in every couple of days and take a look at it and clean it off with vinegar if you need to keep it looking the way you want. And then after maybe 3 weeks, if you want to wax it, you can wax it and then leave it to continue aging for the rest of the 12 weeks. And that is making Gouda. Thanks for joining us.